This episode of the Masonic Roundtable is sponsored by our good friends at Masonic Revival. Brother Edgar and his Masonic design group have inspired elegance for the modern Freemason since 2009 by providing a wide selection of quality Masonic apparels, aprons, accessories, and more. Check out Edgar's amazing selection of apparel or partner with him to create something custom for your own lodge by visiting www.masonicrevival.com. Isn't it about time for a Masonic revival?
Okay, welcome back to the Masonic Roundtable. This is a weekly program where Masons from around the world get together to talk about Masonic news and opinions in a friendly and social manner. As a reminder, the thoughts and opinions expressed here are solely the opinions of the participants and do not represent any Grand Lodge statements or positions. Make sure you keep your conversations open for the public and on the level. To interact with us, send questions and comments to the Facebook event page or in the chat running alongside this YouTube video. My name is John Ruark. I'm a past master of the Patriot Lodge number 1957 in Fairfax, Virginia. And with us tonight, we have Mike the Intern. Say hi, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Mike the Intern here. It's Mike Hambrick from Triandria Lodge number 780 in Rock Creek, Ohio, where I am the junior steward and lodge education officer. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Mike. And also, last host for tonight, Jason Richards. How's it going?
I'm good. Jason Richards here, past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, member of the Colonial Lodge number 1821 in Washington, D.C.
Great. And tonight, for this week's episode, we have special guest, Brother PD Newman, who's a 32nd degree Mason out of Tupelo, Mississippi, from Tupelo Lodge number 318. Is that correct?
That's right. Tupelo.
Tupelo. Thank you. Thank you for the pronunciation.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
All right. All right. So as a reminder, we do have a new Patreon that's up. And I'm working out some technical bugs on my end. Otherwise, I'd show you the page here. But you can go on over to patreon.com/the Masonic Roundtable to become a supporter of the show. We've already had a great response. And because it's the beginning of the month, we'll soon be setting up those perks. So thank you all for contributing. And you'll see a couple things come your way in the next couple of weeks. So we're getting new pins pressed. We're setting up some of the new Facebook groups and the like. So it'll be a blast. Thanks again. Let's get right into this week's topic, one that's been highly requested and one that I personally have been looking forward to.
Highly requested by one particular individual.
At least by one YouTube person who wouldn't leave it alone for like 3 months. But also one that's very interesting from my perspective, because as soon as I saw this book, we've talked about this book a couple times in earlier episodes, and I could not put it down. So I'm going to hand it off to you, PD, to say what would be the short introduction of what this book is about. Let's set the stage for everyone who's not familiar with your book, Alchemically Stoned.
Well, what it's about is what appears to be the use of an entheogenic compound meaning psychedelic or hallucinogenic compound called dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, that's gotten a lot of attention since the publication of Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule, which there was also a documentary made about that. But since those were published, you see it all over the place with ayahuasca tourism, and the last place anyone expected to see it, including myself, was in Freemasonry. But that's what appears to be what was going on among certain alchemically inclined 18th century Freemasons, perhaps even since the fraternity's inception. There's still a lot of research to be done, but the basic premise of the book is exploring anywhere that this could have possibly been used within Freemasonry. And there was surprisingly several instances, in addition to just the presence of the sprig of acacia in Masonry itself, which acacia being one of the prime sources for DMT in nature.
So Let's see. I'm getting my eyepiece that and getting some feedback. Are you guys getting an echo?
No,
Okay.
we're good. You're just muted, or you're just not coming through very clear.
Okay. How about now? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm hearing you better now.
Great. Okay. So the question
Oh,
I have.
now echo.
Oh, jeez. Let me disconnect from here.
No, you're good now.
Okay.
Oh, and he dropped off.
No, I'm here. So what I wanted to ask was, how could, what would you say to those people who would say that this is all made up, this is not a real thing, that this is all just hearsay? What would be your response to that?
Well, my response would be that's perfectly healthy reaction, and that's exactly the way I would react if anyone had came to me with this same information. It's not something that you expect to find, but the minute you start exploring what we term the ancient mysteries, these ancient mystery traditions, it becomes glaringly apparent that these compounds played a significant role in many different traditions, from the Eleusinian mysteries to what's called the Soma of the ancient Vedantas to the Halma of the Zoroastrians, just culture after culture of what you would call a mystery, basically that has its own mystery traditions within it. You see the use of specific compounds, and Masonry. The main thing about it that makes it difficult is that we're dealing with something that from its inception was kind of an oral tradition. Even whenever we saw the degrees written down, they were written down as exposés and not official documents. So, it's murky in the early days, but by the time we get to the mid 18th century, say around 1762, which is whenever a rite was created by a man named Pyotr Melesino in Russia. But whenever his rite was created, that's the first time we start seeing acacia treated as something other than just a symbol in Freemasonry. Of course, in the Master Mason degree, it's merely a symbol. It represents, as they say, the immortality of the soul. Or if you read in Mackey, he says it represents innocence. So it's just a symbol. But the minute you start getting into some of these Masonic rites that have heavy alchemical overtones, the acacia becomes something else. You see people actually drinking concoctions made from acacia, and you don't drink symbols. So that's already problematic. And the descriptions that we find in some of these are perfectly in keeping with the descriptions of the subjective effects of low to moderate and sometimes high doses of tryptamines, which DMT is what you would call a tryptamine psychedelic. So yeah, to those people, any detractors that would say this is absolutely crazy, I would say, yeah, it's absolutely crazy, and that's what makes it so exciting for me. But the skepticism is healthy and warranted, I think.
Yeah. So that to that point, when I first read the book, I was blown away, absolutely blown away, with the level of detail and research that you did, combining a collection of rites, some things from the College of Rites, some things from other sources, where you're showing, if you're not showing causality, you're showing a lot of correlation between
Right.
similarities of different initiatic mystery schools that have, like you said, some sort of concoction, some sort of absorption of a material as part of an initiation rite to get to the outcome of a mystical experience.
That's right. That's right. And in my book, I stressed that the reason that kind of thing would have been important um, to some of these more early initiations is that you have really two different types of initiation. You have what you would call formal initiation, and you have what you would call what I would call actual initiation. So formal initiation is meant to plant seeds that through the application of those teachings they might develop into actual gnosis or revelation or something larger than just the baby steps were given in some initiation ceremonies, whereas uh, actual initiation would be the actual revelation experience without those baby steps, without leading to that. So that being said, not everyone who we might consider an initiate by their own wisdom was formally initiated, and neither are all formal initiates have they actually attained um, what we would call the fullness of the initiation instead of just the initial part of it, the beginning of it, which is what the word implies, an initiation, the beginning of something. So in these ancient cultures, these substances became sort of a fail-safe means whereby you could induce these deeper heightened states of consciousness at one and the same time as when a formal initiation was happening. So that's kind of the difference of how they were experiencing than we do. Our initiations in Masonry are very much kind of a beginning of something and planting of seeds that would take time and inculcation. But these cultures and traditions um, wanted it to be in the moment, and it was important because you got to keep the context and the time in mind. These people had no real concept of what we call a drug, much less a psychedelic, a hallucinogen. Um, so it would have been met with just such incredible novelty, I think, that they really would have believed they were encountering angels and divinities. So the minute this substance would have been discovered and applied, the first thought on some of these mystics' minds would have been, this satisfies all of the necessities and requirements we've ever been taught about the philosopher's stone, the whole goal of alchemy, which is to produce this substance that somehow um, corrects all wrongs. It somehow dissolves metals. And one of the things that dawned on me during one of my first experiences with the substance was, yeah, it doesn't just dissolve metals; it dissolves the whole world, right in front of you.
Right.
Uh, so, um, it's
It reminds me a little bit of, there's a quote that was attributed to Mark Twain that has been adapted for Freemasonry, which I believe the Mark Twain quote goes, you're born twice, once when you're born and once when you figure out why. And I've heard it adapted to Freemasonry to say you are initiated twice, once through the degrees and another when you find out why.
nice. Yeah, I've never heard that, but that's certainly applicable to what we're talking about.
Right. So it's multiple veils deeper.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's important. We Freemasons, we put a lot of stock into what we do in these rituals and their impact on us. And it should be veils within veils. It should be over your head. I think it should make you reach. It should make you jump. It shouldn't be within your grasp. And I think that the minute you think it is in your grasp is the minute it starts to lose its real magic, its real essence. And that's the real beauty of it, I think, in the first place.
I was also intrigued to find that I'd already done some independent research prior to reading your book about the Acacia DMT connection, but also was surprised to see you go into the ergot and the fly agaric fungus as well. So do you mind expanding a little bit on that too? So those who they may be dabbling and figuring out this whole DMT connection. What else did you find with these other psychoactive substances?
Well, I kind of have to give a little bit of a qualifier here that I'm convinced that DMT was being used via certain species of acacia by specific factions of Freemasons in the 18th century. So in order to try and find out if any others, just as supporting evidence, I looked to see if there was any other substances maybe not being used, but any symbolism that might point to it, just as supporting evidence. And I was surprised to find a little bit more than I ever expected. But I do need to point out that I don't think Freemasons were using either of those substances, ergot or the Amanita muscari mushrooms. What I suspect happened there is that we know that Freemasonry is a kind of repository for the ancient mysteries. And because some of those ancient mysteries were using psychedelic compounds in their initiations, and because we borrowed some of those same symbols, perhaps unknowingly, not completely aware of what they were hinting at within their original context, we inevitably have symbolism that shows up within Freemasonry from those other cultures that is wrapped up with their use of certain entheogens. And those two happen to be the ergot, which ergot, according to Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck's book, The Road to Eleusis, we never knew what they were doing at Eleusis. We knew that they were drinking some kind of a beverage called kikion that somehow was inducing a transcendental experience in thousands of participants at a time without fail. And remember, we talked about that fail-safe means to induce this stuff, these types of experiences. And so what they posited was because the Rarian Plain, which is adjacent to Eleusis, it's a wild rye meadow, which is naturally carries this ergot fungus. I believe it was Claviceps purpurea was the particular strain. But they hypothesized basically that it was this stuff being used, this ergot kernels, which is what it's the ultimate source for lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. It's the precursor for it. So what they posited was that they were using this stuff, to induce mass experiences. And some of the symbols, like I said, the symbols that are pertinent there are the shafts of wheat suspended next to or perhaps beneath a waterfall. And the reason that's significant is that the psychoactive compounds in the ergot that grows on this stuff they're water soluble. Through a simple pour over, you pour water over it, the psychoactive compounds are going to come out, and all the toxic compounds that would normally cause the things like gangrene and the dancing diseases of the Middle Ages and all those things we saw from eating tainted breads, all that stuff is not water soluble. So that's one of the things. And one of their proofs for why that was used, I think, it comes from the Homeric hymn to Demeter. I believe that's it, where it gives the recipe as being water, barley groats, and pennyroyal mint leaves. Well, pennyroyal mint leaves, aside from some of the thuhone content, are mildly psychedelic, but not enough to induce experience on par with what was happening at Eleusis. But the other ingredient, being barley groats, is significant, as that's where one would find the ergot kernels. So
it's fascinating. Ham, you had a question?
No, because as he was going along, it actually, he ends up saying it. So, because what it was, he was talking about the wheat and the the moss that was growing on moss, right? That's what it was, or fungus.
Fungus.
Yeah, that was growing on there. And I remembered reading something about that that fungus growing on the wheat, and the very fact that they would ingest it, as a wheat, not knowing that it had the fungus on it, and it would induce these hallucinogenic effects. And I mean, so they actually didn't make the connection at first, but eventually, that's where they find that they get it from. But I just remember reading something about that.
And Pike, I don't know if you're familiar with his Book of Words, where he kind of gives a really great description of every Masonic word that shows up as passwords and substitute words, etc. But when he gets to the password of the second degree, which I'm not going to say, but it's the one that points to the shaft of weed and the waterfall. He says, this is the one that I can't figure out. I can't figure out where this came from. It doesn't make any sense. The description given is completely just off the wall. It doesn't make any sense. So he was baffled by it. But if you look at Robert Hewitt Brown's stellar Masonic astrology, stellar theology and Masonic astrology, I think is the title.
Yep, that's it.
But he actually gives a very great breakdown of it in terms of the goddess Sibyl, the goddess of grain and corn, and identifies her with Demeter and Isis, and ties it directly back to the Eleusinian mysteries without even knowing, because it came, his book came, decades before Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck's research into what was happening at Eleusis. So pretty significant, pretty intuitive on Brown's part.
Very cool. Jason?
Yeah, so PD, I've got a question for you. Maybe back several months ago, or maybe about a year ago now, Fratero and I were talking about just the initiatic experience in general, and how you can achieve certain states of consciousness through just years and years and years of meditation and mental training. But at the same time, DMT and other psychedelic substances, ayahuasca and the like, could be seen as a shortcut to that kind of transcendental state. And my question is, do you think using something like DMT is taking the easy way out to enlightenment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get it kind of frequently. I'm always reluctant to say that what we're experiencing on any compound is identical to what anyone is experiencing from any religious practice, any more than, a Franciscan monk is experiencing the same thing that a yogi is experiencing. Language plays a huge part in the way these experiences are interpreted. But that being said, are you familiar with G.I. Gurdjieff, the Armenian mystic?
I am not.
Okay, he founded a system he calls the Fourth Way. Really fantastic teacher who was involved with Sufism, and according to Tobias Churton, he was also a closet Freemason, but had to kind of keep it under wraps because of the area he was living in and around Russia at the time. But so he founded this system called the Fourth Way, and the Fourth Way is the way of the sly man, he says. And one of his students was a man named PD Uspensky, who learned directly under him and wrote a book about his teachings called In Search of the Miraculous. But in this book, Gurdjieff says, they ask him, well, what is the Fourth Way? How is it different than other systems? And he says, well, the first way is the way of the fakir. And through a month of physical tortures, he can get his body to produce a substance that is desirable that causes, he doesn't really describe it, but he says there's this substance that you're trying to produce. He says the second way is the way of the monk, and through a week of emotional tortures, they can get their body to produce the same substance in less time. He says the third way is the way of the yogi, who through a single day of mental tortures and exercises, he can get the same result. But the sly man, the fourth way, the sly man knows that the same substance can be found in nature, and he puts the substance in a pill and eats it without any loss of time and gets the same result. So that demonstrates that there are at least factions of people that believe it's a shortcut, and that, there's no need to put yourself through all these tortures. But at the same time, I feel like it's important also to kind of use them. The one of the reasons they're so powerful during initiation is because they induce faith, and the reason they induce faith is because they induce gnosis. I find it possible to have one without the other. It's just, if you have faith without gnosis, it seems to be kind of um, fleeting, and kind of taking someone else at their word. And then even when you've had gnosis, the minute it's gone, you can doubt it and say, "Did I? Was that real? Was I hallucinating? Did that just really happen?"
Mhm.
So even when you've had gnosis, faith is important, because you have to have faith in the fact that you had gnosis.
Right.
So
And so that's, you bring up a great point too, because if you look at a lot of the way people would experience this, right? So I mean, right at the surface, right? It is a psychoactive substance, right? And it's not in the same. It is and it isn't, but it's in the same vein of, it is a hallucinogen. You do experience something that is not in the material world in front of you, and so the other thing to consider, though, is it is not for fun. It's not a recreational experience, in that it will expose things and transform. I mean, most people, what I found fascinating doing original DMT research, and I think the Spirit Molecule documentary is on Netflix, that one thing I found really, really fascinating was that most people who, let's just say DMT, take DMT, all have similar reactions, all have similar visuals, similar experiences, similar tracks of time that they feel they're passing through, and so they all come from different aspects of life, but have common shared uh, imagery and experience,
mm-hmm.
and are often transformed no matter what state they're in. They came in, and so to your point, um, if you have a faith background, no matter what that is behind that now you're associating that this is preparation for you to reach that next level of your faith, it can be that much more powerful of an experience.
Indeed, and that's, we still don't know what's going on
Right.
with the DMT experience. We don't know if we're tapping into something that's objective in some way. We don't know if it's completely subjective experience. We do know there's a book by Benny Shannon, who's the professor of psychology at Hebrew University in Israel. He wrote a book called The Antipodes of the Mind, charting the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience. And he makes it pretty clear that it's a finite number of things that you experience on ayahuasca. It's not infinite. It's not like anything can happen. It's a very finite number, and these things seem to happen over and over and over and over and over with different people. um, and a Jungian might argue that of course it looks the same, because what we're dealing with is the collective unconscious. We're seeing
Mhm.
the internal landscape of the mind, and what's called the archetypes coming to the fore, and you're sort of interacting with your own collective unconscious in a trip. But even so, in the moment, it's impossible to just stand back and say that when you're experiencing it. It is so terrifyingly real that there's no way to stand back and say I'm just on a drug. This is DMT. This is going to pass. You are interacting with intelligences that are interacting with you and communicating things to you that you have never you could not have conceived of prior to that experience, have never thought of in your life, and somehow you're being presented this information that was just waiting for you to take DMT so you could tell it to yourself. I mean, it's problematic to say the least, as far as what's going on, but um, it's enough to make a believer out of the most erudite, or at least admit the mystery that we're all stuck in. That there's something going on that we just can't possibly explain or begin to understand. That's one of the beauties of DMT. Also, it puts you face to face with the same mystery of existence that our ancestors knew every morning when the sun rose, but we forget. You know, we get up and turn off our alarm clocks and crank up our cars and completely forget that we are just face to face with something that is beyond terrifying, and that it's strange and improbable, and uh, all those other wonderful things that put you in that sacred space of vulnerability that makes real change possible. You know.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Now you are coming out with a second edition of your book,
That's
correct?
right.
And tell me a little bit more about, maybe you found some new research that you've been digging up to add in.
We kind of ran into a wall with the previous book of excuse me, the previous edition, where we found definite instances of where specific Masons, in particular white rites, were referring to drinking, ingesting a substance that they were getting from acacia. But we couldn't figure out where this was coming from. Where did the tradition start? Where did it end? Uh, and that's really what's so exciting about this second edition, is we've kind of gotten some answers, um, as far as number one, where Melissino acquired it, which we now know that he studied under a Paracelsian uh, German alchemist doctor who taught him the mystery. So you know, that's a whole new area to explore. And on top of the Cagliostro stuff, we had Cagliostro using drinking a concoction of acacia in his apprentice and companion rituals of his Egyptian rite, but with no indication of where it came from. So another thing that's come up is about 18 years prior to when Cagliostro created his Egyptian rite, this guy named Friedrich von Koppen created something called Afrikanische Bauherren, which means the African builders or African architects, um, which he used Africa in the sense of Egypt. So it was a Masonic rite that styled itself as Egyptian nearly 2 decades prior to Cagliostro's Egyptian rite. Well, once I started investigating this rite, I found out that the von Koppen character had written this text called the Krata Rapoa, which he claimed to be the authentic initiation rituals that were imparted in the Great Pyramid in Egypt.
Okay.
And it was this text on which he based his rite. And in the seventh degree of this rite, the candidate is given a libation to drink that is called oimelas. And he doesn't tell anything about it. He just says, oh, it's oimelas, spelled Oimellas. And the translator, he speculates that this is a blend of wine and honey based on an etymological analysis of oinos for oi, and then mela means honey, so oimelas being wine and honey. So that was interesting. You know, I thought, could this somehow acacia be involved also? But there was no indication of acacia there. Well, in the remarkable synchronistic turn, I was contacted by a professional alchemist in India who actually owns an alchemy company that makes medicines, and who had been reading my stuff, following my research, and basically said, "Yeah, I think you're spot on." He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to reproduce um, the DMT elixir the way it would have been produced by or the early alchemists." And he said, "And I think I've figured it out. I found a tincture that works, very powerful, no physical side effects, meaning no nausea or purging, which is really common with ayahuasca."
Mhm.
And I said, "That's fantastic. Can you tell me how you make it?" And he said, "Well, it's complicated, but I can tell you that it requires two main ingredients: pomegranate wine vinegar and honey." And so I'm immediately saying, "Well, that's amazing, because I just found this text and he's talking about it takes wine and honey." And he said, "Well, yes, with just wine and honey, using Paracelsus's basic, what he calls the primum ens technique, he can use wine and honey, get enough of the DMT out of the acacia to produce a beverage that he says tastes and smells wonderful." Um, which that is significant also, because ayahuasca does not taste and smell wonderful. It smells like horse stalls and it tastes like bile. It is absolutely awful.
Sounds
So,
absolutely entertaining to take.
well, so he says that he's figured out this way to make it where it doesn't taste bad. Um, so fast forward, I don't know, about a week, and I'm trying to find any alchemical text that might reference acacia at all, so I can try and find a line on this tradition. Well, I find this text called La Treize Saint Trino Sophie, which means most holy threefold wisdom, I think. Uh, um, but anyway, the text is allegedly written by Cagliostro, so I got excited and I start looking. And the first thing I see in section 6 is this bird holding a sprig of acacia in its mouth. And it's clearly a sprig of acacia because it has the same, what's called bipinnate compound leaf structure that all acacia species have, like a mimosa.
Mhm.
So I start reading in section 6 under this picture of this bird with this acacia in its mouth, and it's this guy describing an experience. Somebody hands him a crystal goblet full of a saffron colored liquor that he drinks. He says it smells and tastes delicious, and that it made him stronger, braver, and increased his intelligence. All of those symptoms are consistent with the subjective effects of low to moderate doses of DMT. So we have a concoction associated with Cagliostro again on top of his Egyptian rite that's supposed to taste delicious and smell wonderful, which is perfectly in line with this pomegranate wine vinegar honey production that sounds like Oimelas, the wine and honey mixture from von Kappen. So
Wow.
lots of synchronicities, lots of all within the same tradition, all attributed to the same people, all talking about an Egyptian Freemasonry, which is important because the Egyptians actually did revere acacia. They believed in their mythology, Osiris was trapped within the acacia tree. Um, so you have to think about what that's saying. Their god was in the tree. Uh,
Mhm.
so
Which also, there's the common uh, occurrence of acacia throughout the Bible as well.
right. The shittim wood.
Exactly.
Uh, Several things throughout the Bible are made
From
from
Noah's
acacia.
Ark to the Ark of the Covenant to depending on the tradition, the true cross of Jesus. Right. So
The crown of thorns, acacia. The Greek physician that named acacia, Dioscorides, named it acacia because of its thorns. Acacia means thorn.
Mhm.
Most acacia trees have thorns on them, and Pike specifically associates both the crown of thorns and the cross with acacia.
So symbolic or not, there's definitely a linkage there.
At least a tradition of that line of thought. You're exactly right, which is important to point out because it doesn't matter if this was the actual tradition of the original cross. What's important is that there was a tradition that thought it was.
Right. Very fascinating. I did have another question. Robert Johnson sends his regrets, but he did have a couple questions he wanted to send along to you as well.
Okay.
So his question to you is: we know definitely that a lot of our rites have ancient origins, and we know that they went from somewhere to Egypt, then to Greece and Rome by the way of conquering, etc. And we know that, for lack of a better term, drugs were used to supplement the experience. As Freemasonry, is it really as really a modern rite? Was it somewhat the product of a Renaissance Enlightenment ideas that obviously amalgamated several different systems? They were deliberate in how we did that, right? We've talked before in the past of the show about how, if you really peel back the layer, get inside of the ritual and look beyond the exoteric, the literal words, and try to figure out what's going on, what's said. That Freemasonry is this syncretic philosophy system, right, that takes from lots of different traditions. Is it your opinion that that the acacia as we know it today is a deliberate reference to the intake of such a plant for use of expanding the experience? Like, was its used for DMT? And if so, what MAOI, and if you could describe what an MAO inhibitor is for the audience, what MAOI do you suspect would have been used to help reap that benefit?
Well, the significance of the MAOI, which is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, that's what's commonly used by ayahuasca using tribes in South America. The reason being, dimethyltryptamine at normal active doses is not orally active. The monoamine oxidase in the gut burns it up, never makes it into the bloodstream. But if you take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, which it's present in a number of plants. In the Amazon, they use a plant called Banisteriopsis caapi. Here in the South, we have something called passion flower that's full of MAOI. But they would use that to, as people say, potentiate or activate the DMT. That's true. However, MAOI is not necessary to trip on DMT. Number one, you can smoke it. Number two, you can snuff it, snort it, as long as it's been mixed with calcinated shells or bones, which is the case with the Yanomamo. They use a snuff called yopo, prepared from the seeds of Anadenanthera peregrina and Anadenanthera colubrina, and create this DMT-rich snuff called yopo. So those two ways, no MAO is required. Now, it wasn't until I spoke with the alchemist I talked about earlier, Eric J. Laporte, or J. Eric Laporte. He was the first one that told me you don't need an MAOI to have an oral experience with DMT. You just have to take 3, maybe 4 times the dose to overwhelm the monoamine oxidase in the stomach, and then you can still experience it. So I tried it I took about 45 grams of Acacia confucia root bark. Definitely had an experience. So he was certainly correct in that supposition. So as to which MAOI was used, maybe none. There's no evidence of an MAOI outside of Cagliostro's stuff. And
would you still get a negative nauseated experience afterwards if you
yes,
triple the dose?
Just because of the other tannins and stuff that's present in the root bark. It's full of bioflavonoids and beta carbolines that just don't feel great on the stomach. But with the alchemical method, what's actually happening is DMT is being extracted out of the acacia and then being merged into something else. So you're taking away all of that superfluous material that would make you nauseous if you prepare it alchemically, and you're just left with the active substance. Now, as to whether or not the initial question, do I think acacia was put into masonry because of its psychoactive potential, or were later Freemasons like Cagliostro, etc., merely using it to those ends because they knew of its psychoactive potential? We can't know that, but there's some really exciting information that is surrounding the very beginning of Freemasonry. So when Freemasonry was created, if you look at all of the early exposés, you won't find a single reference to acacia. You'll find a reference to cassia, a sprig of cassia. Cassia is actually Cassia cinnamonum or cinnamonum cassia. I can't remember the actual name, but it's like cinnamon. It's native to China, and outside of a couple of there's a couple of drugs in cinnamon, but I mean it's such a minute amount. It's not psychoactive to any real degree. But that's what shows up in masonry, in the Master Mason degree, up until about the 1730s to 1740s. Then all of a sudden, cassia becomes acacia in every expose you see. No, you won't see after 1745 any expose you read gives acacia. And if you go look at, say, Mackey argues that the reason cassia was included in the first place was because it was a mistake, that these people couldn't pronounce the word, and any word that had a or any other value as its initial letter, that letter would be sunk into the word and basically go away, and acacia would become cassia. However, you look at, say, the rituals of William Preston, who was an incredibly learned man. He gives cassia, and so you'd be hard pressed to convince anyone that William Preston couldn't pronounce or read the word acacia.
Right.
So that's problematic.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what it looks like, have you read Dr. David Harrison's book, The Genesis of Freemasonry?
Not the Genesis, no. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, in there, he provides lots of evidence, demonstrates that Desaguliers, John Theophilus Desaguliers, who was the
third Grandmaster.
Third Grandmaster of the Premier Grand Lodge of London.
Mm-hmm.
He was
arguably the one who wrote the third degree ritual.
Exactly. So that's what I'm getting to. Not wrote it, but changed it, because we changed do have versions of it. Right. So he's the one that made significant changes to the third degree, so many that we really don't know all of them. But one of them, I suspect, was the change from cassia to acacia. So why would Desaguliers want to switch it from cassia to acacia? It just so happens that he was research assistant to Sir Isaac Newton in the Royal Society.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Royal Society, the elected president of the Royal Society, Robert Boyle, he wrote up what he called his wish list for the society, what he wanted them to acquire for them to study, because they were intensely interested in it. And this list, you can find it online. It was put up on display at the Royal Society in 2010. But in this wish list, numbers 12 and 13, it says that they desire to acquire potent drugs to alter or exalt imagination. And he specifically says hallucinogenic drugs. And he says something about fungus. He wants to acquire the fungus that was mentioned by the French author. He doesn't say which French author. So we know that the Royal Society was actively investigating psychedelic compounds, and Desaguliers, an alchemist, research assistant to Sir Isaac Newton in the Royal Society, another alchemist. It looks like this is the tree to be barking up.
So the actual item on the list is that they wish to acquire pleasing dreams and physical exercises exemplified by the Egyptian electuary and by the fungus mentioned by the French author.
Right, and the other of the hallucinogenic drugs and potent drugs to alter or exalt imagination. So Desaguliers was actively involved with a bunch of cats that were looking into this stuff, that were looking into psychedelic drugs.
Now, let me offer a counterpoint here, is to say that some of the research I've done on the Royal Society is that as a scientific system, they were want for a repeatable process like we think of the scientific method today. That science, and specifically the Royal Society, was an elitist theory club at best, where science was just, hey, you know what? I heard like this woman had 4 arms in this faraway land. I bet that's a real thing. Yeah, I bet it is too. And it was all like one-upping each other. And so, well, I'm not saying that. I mean, again, that is exactly Boyle's list.
Even if they were a bunch of dudes that were one-upping each other, researching drugs.
Oh, there you go. Good answer. Good answer.
But yeah, they like I said, they were definitely researching it, and they were all, since their inception. You look at the beginning with Ashmole. You know, Ashmole was created the museum because he was into oddities. So one of the primary interests of the Royal Society was the, oddities, weird stuff, and particularly alchemy. As you see, the Welsh alchemist Thomas Vaughan, who wrote under the name Eugenius Philalethes, he was his patron was Sir Robert Maoi, who, along with Ashmole, was among the first to be made speculative Freemasons. And those, Maoi was the first president, and Ashmole one of the founders, and both of them Freemasons. So even back then, the Royal Society, the Masonic guilds were already actively interested in what the guys that went on to create the Royal Society founded. But they were all interested in alchemy. When Maoi, he was, like I said, the patron of Thomas Vaughan. When Vaughan died, he willed all of his alchemical books and journals to Maoi, and Maoi was eventually given an apartment at Whitehall, where he was the king's personal alchemist. And there are records of him sending stuff back to the Royal Society saying, hey, I just extracted lead from a rock and converted that lead to silver. And that was, to them, that was science, that was knowledge. So it was definitely at the inception of what we'd call the beginning stages, the baby steps of the scientific revolution.
Well, that's a really good stopping point, because I think we've kind of reached a great time limit. Although we could talk for hours, I'm sure. I want to thank you in advance, because this was a wealth of knowledge, a lot of good feedback from the live listeners in the YouTube chat. And
my pleasure.
And just maybe we can have a part 2 later on, maybe after you get the book out and you get some feedback. So it'd be great to have you back on. Let's go over to Mike the intern, since I've been usurping a lot of the time, and hand it off for Mike's final thoughts, shameless plugs, and any last questions for our guests. So, Mike.
Well, I'll start with I don't have any questions at this time, but the very fact that I haven't read the book, listening to you talk about it and everything in it has induced me to make sure I get the book as soon as possible. So, because I really do need to read up on this and understand it better. Because actually, from even the short academia paper that you have out here, I was able to get the idea of how much research you put into it. So I'm impressed with that. So I know that it's going to be something worth reading.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
All right. Hey, so PD, should Mike wait for that next edition, or should just go buy it now and get the second edition?
Absolutely, you want the second edition. It's going
Okay.
to be it, and one of
Okay.
the things that a lot of my readers will be able to know, it's going to have an index, which the first one didn't. So
Nice.
Oh, cool.
Very cool. Okay, Jason Richards, what say you?
All right, Brother Newman, thanks so much for coming on. This has been a really, really interesting show, and I'm glad we were able to make the technology work to to get you out with us tonight.
my pleasure.
So looking forward to meeting you in person in June of next year, to have you up for the Mid-Atlantic Esotericon, Esoteric Freemasonry Conference up here in my neck of the woods on June 15th. So that's going to be absolutely awesome. So
I'm excited about it.
yeah, it's going to be fantastic. We're so glad that it's going to be a really good time. Also looking forward to reading the second edition of your book. The acacia is above and beyond everything else my favorite Masonic symbol. And so the idea that the acacia having such a deep esoteric significance, but then also being something that some Masonic used to heighten the initiatic experience is also really, really interesting to me.
Mhm.
So that was by far my favorite part of your book was your focus on the acacia.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thank you so much. And John, I'll hand it back to you.
All right. Again, thank you very much, PD, for coming on. Like I said in the green room, I wanted to personally thank you for the research you did. I know it was a lot of work, a lot of research, and
Labor of love.
yeah, you could absolutely shows. And so I've learned a lot from what you've done, and I want to thank you for your contribution to Masonry as a whole.
Thank you so much.
For what you've done. And again, I look forward to meeting you in person soon. So yeah, it's really all I can say, because it's such a well thought out piece of work that while there are still some things, like with most of Masonry, there's a lot of correlations and very few causal things that you can directly link. But even as you describe the linkages between Desaguliers, right, and the Royal Society, that there's too many coincidences
Mhm.
in Masonry, and you do an excellent job of kind of laying all the data out there, laying all the cards on the table, and say, "I'm not saying it's aliens, right?
Right. Careful as possible.
Right. I'm not saying it's DMT, but it's DMT."
But it's TMT. It's exactly right.
So excellent work, and thank you again. And we'll definitely have you back on for further conversation. I'm sure this conversation's not over yet.
I look forward to it. It's been a lot of fun.
All right. Well, thank you all for the rest of you who've watched, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much for watching, and keep searching for more light. Have a good night.